The reel-to-reel tapes sat in a cardboard box in the basement of the Louis Armstrong House Museum for nearly 20 years before anyone thought to listen to them. They were labeled in Louis's handwriting, Private Lessons, J.C., 1956 to 1959. Museum archivists assumed they were recordings of Louis teaching some session musicians, maybe something for an educational project that never materialized. Not particularly interesting compared to the thousands of other recordings in the collection. But in 1995, a graduate student named Michael Cogswell was cataloging the basement archives when he decided to digitize a few of the Private Lessons tapes just to see what was on them. What he heard stopped him cold. Louis Armstrong's voice, patient and encouraging, teaching trumpet to a child. And the child playing back, note for note, with a precision and emotional depth that seemed impossible for someone so young. "That's it, James. Now do it again, but this time, make it cry. Don't just play the notes. Make them feel something." And then the sound of a trumpet, played by a child who could not have been more than 12 or 13 years old, making the instrument weep in ways that professional musicians spent lifetimes trying to achieve. Cogswell listened to hours of these recordings, stunned by what he was hearing. Louis Armstrong had secretly mentored a child prodigy for 3 years, and no one knew about it. The recordings documented weekly lessons, Louis teaching technique and theory, but mostly teaching feeling, teaching how to make music matter. And at the end of every tape, Louis would say the same thing: "You're going to be the next me, James. Maybe even better than me." Cogswell immediately began trying to find out who James was, what had happened to him, why this mentorship had been kept secret. What he eventually uncovered was not a success story. It was a tragedy that Louis Armstrong had carried to his grave. Harlem, 1956. Louis Armstrong was at the height of his fame, touring constantly but returning to New York whenever he could to spend time at his home in Corona, Queens. He was 55 years old, wealthy and celebrated, but also reflective about legacy and mortality in ways he had not been when he was younger. He thought about what he would leave behind beyond the music. He thought about passing on what he had learned. One afternoon in May, Louis was walking through Harlem after a recording session when he heard trumpet music coming from a building on 125th Street. Not professional music. Someone practicing, someone young, based on the occasional squeaks and hesitations. But there was something about the phrasing, the way the notes connected, that made Louis stop walking and listen. Whoever was playing understood rhythm instinctively, was trying to make the trumpet sing rather than just play. Louis followed the sound to St. Francis Home for Boys, a Catholic orphanage run by the Sisters of Charity. He walked to the front desk and asked who was playing trumpet. Sister Mary Catherine, the director, looked surprised that someone like Louis Armstrong was standing in her office. She explained that the boy playing was James Crawford, 12 years old, who had been at the orphanage since he was 6. His mother had died of tuberculosis. His father was unknown. James had picked up a donated trumpet 2 years ago and taught himself to play it by listening to the radio, by mimicking Louis Armstrong records specifically. Sister Mary said James was difficult, angry, didn't get along with other children, but when he played trumpet he became someone else entirely, focused and peaceful. Louis asked if he could meet James. Sister Mary led him to a small practice room where a thin black boy sat hunched over a battered trumpet, working through a scale. James looked up, saw Louis Armstrong standing in the doorway, and his eyes went wide. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Louis said, "You play pretty good, son. Who taught you?" James's voice was quiet, wary. "Nobody taught me. I taught myself. Listening to your records." Louis nodded. "I can hear that. You got good ears. But you're holding your embouchure wrong. You keep doing it like that, you're going to hurt yourself. Want me to show you the right way?" That was how it started. Louis showed James the correct way to position his lips, to breathe from his diaphragm to support long notes without straining. They worked together for about an hour, and by the end Louis knew he had found something rare. This child had natural talent that could not be taught, the kind of musical instinct that appears maybe once in a generation. But James also had something else, a hunger and a pain that drove the music, that made even simple scales sound like they mattered emotionally. Louis saw himself in this boy, not just the talent but the background, the poverty, the orphan status, the use of music as escape from circumstances that felt unbearable. Before he left, Louis made James a promise. "I'm going to come back next week. Same time. We're going to work together. I'm going to teach you everything I know. But you can't tell nobody about this. Not the other kids. Not anybody. This is between you and me. Can you keep a secret?" James nodded, unable to speak, tears running down his face. Louis understood that this moment was changing the boy's life, giving him something he had never had. Attention from someone who saw value in him. Investment from someone who believed he could be more than just another orphan kid. For the next 3 years, Louis Armstrong made good on his promise. Every week when he was in New York, he would go to St. Francis Home for Boys and spend 2 hours teaching James Crawford how to play trumpet. Sister Mary Catherine gave them a private room and told the other children that James was doing extra music study, but she never revealed who the teacher was. Louis paid for a good trumpet for James, paid for maintenance and repairs, brought him records to study, sheet music to practice. But mostly, Louis taught James how to feel music, how to make it personal, how to let emotion flow through the instrument instead of just technical proficiency. The reel-to-reel recordings that Michael Cogswell discovered in 1995 documented these lessons in intimate detail. Louis's voice teaching, correcting, encouraging. James's trumpet responding, improving week by week, becoming more confident and expressive. There were recordings of them playing duets together, Louis and James trading phrases, the boy matching the legend note for note, sometimes even surprising Louis with an unexpected turn of phrase or emotional choice. On one tape from 1958, Louis tells James, "You got something special, son. All. You got the gift. I don't know where it comes from, but you got it. And I'm going to make sure you don't waste it." James's response, captured on tape, is barely audible but devastating. "You're the only person who ever thought I was worth anything, Mr. Armstrong." Louis's voice cracks slightly when he responds, "You're worth everything, James. And one day, the whole world is going to know it." By 1959, James was 15 years old, and playing at a level that professionals twice his age struggled to achieve. Louis had started making plans for James's future. He talked to jazz club owners about giving James performance opportunities once he turned 16. He discussed with Sister Mary Catherine about getting James enrolled in a proper music school, offered to pay for it himself. He imagined James as his protege, the young trumpet player he could introduce to the world, the next generation carrying forward the tradition Louis had helped create. But Louis also noticed changes in James that worried him. The boy was becoming more withdrawn, more volatile. He would have periods where the trumpet playing was brilliant, transcendent, and then periods where he could barely hold the instrument, where his hands shook and his focus disappeared. He talked about hearing voices, about feeling like something was wrong inside his head. Louis tried to help, brought in a doctor to examine James, but the doctor found nothing physically wrong and suggested the boy was just under stress from adolescence and orphanage life. In November 1959, James Crawford disappeared. He was supposed to meet Louis for their weekly lesson, but when Louis arrived at St. Francis, Sister Mary Catherine was frantic. James had run away during the night, taking nothing with him except his trumpet. He had left no note, given no warning. Sister Mary contacted the police, but runaway orphans were common, and the police did limited investigation. Louis was devastated. He hired a private detective, Raymond Harris, to search for James. Harris investigated for months, following leads across New York, talking to street musicians and music store owners, checking homeless shelters and hospitals. He found nothing. James Crawford had vanished completely, as if he had never existed. Louis continued the search for over a year, spending thousands of dollars, refusing to believe that a boy with such extraordinary talent could just disappear without a trace. But eventually, the leads dried up completely. Raymond Harris told Louis the hard truth. James was either dead or did not want to be found. And if he did not want to be found, they were not going to find him. Louis Armstrong never fully recovered from losing James. His wife Lucille said that Louis would sometimes sit in his study listening to the lesson tapes, crying while hearing James's trumpet playing back what Louis had taught him. Louis blamed himself for not recognizing how troubled James had been, for focusing on musical talent and missing the mental health crisis that had been building. He wondered if the pressure of being groomed as the next Louis Armstrong had been too much for a 15-year-old orphan to handle. He questioned whether his attention had helped or hurt, whether James might have been better off if Louis had never walked into that orphanage. These questions haunted Louis for the rest of his life. He mentioned James occasionally to close friends, always with regret and pain, always wondering what had happened to the boy with the gift. When Louis Armstrong died in 1971, James Crawford's fate remained one of the great unknowns of his life, a grief he carried that had nothing to do with music, and everything to do with a child he had failed to save. The reel-to-reel tapes remained in storage, unlistened to for over 20 years after Louis' death. When Michael Cogswell discovered them in 1995 and began researching James Crawford's story, he found almost nothing. James had no adult records, no social security history after 1959, no death certificate that matched his name and age. It was as if he had disappeared from existence at age 15, leaving behind only the recordings of Louis teaching him trumpet. Cogswell wrote about the recordings in a jazz history journal, describing them as documentation of Louis Armstrong's unknown mentorship of a child prodigy who had mysteriously vanished. The article attracted some attention in music circles, but without any information about what had happened to James Crawford, it remained an interesting historical footnote rather than a complete story. The truth did not emerge until 2015, 16 years after Cogswell published his article. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist working at Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens, was treating an elderly patient who had been institutionalized on and off for decades. The patient called himself David Johnson, claimed to be 69 years old, and had a long history of schizophrenia with auditory hallucinations. He had been homeless for many years before being admitted to Creedmoor permanently in 2010. He rarely spoke, spent most of his time in silence, and had no known family or friends. In March 2015, David Johnson was dying of lung cancer. During one of their final sessions, Dr. Chen was trying to make him comfortable when she noticed something unusual. The patient was humming, then quietly singing a melody she recognized as a Louis Armstrong song. She mentioned it, said she loved Louis Armstrong's music, and David Johnson's eyes focused on her with unusual clarity. "I knew Louis Armstrong," he said. It was the most he had spoken in months. Dr. Chen, thinking the patient was having a delusion, played along gently. "That must have been wonderful. How did you know him?" David Johnson's response was specific and detailed. He described the orphanage on 125th Street, the practice room, the weekly lessons, the reel-to-reel recorder Louis would set up to capture their sessions. He described the trumpet Louis had bought him, a Bach Stradivarius with a small dent on the bell. He described Louis's teaching style, his laugh, his encouragement, his belief that David would be the next great trumpet player. Dr. Chen was stunned. These were not the vague claims of a delusional patient. These were specific memories. She asked his real name. "James Crawford," he said. "But I haven't been James Crawford for a very long time. I became David Johnson when I ran away. I thought if I changed my name, the voices would stop. They didn't." Over the next few weeks, as David Johnson neared death, he told Dr. Chen the story of James Crawford. He described how the schizophrenia had started around age 14, voices telling him he was worthless, that he did not deserve Louis' attention, that the trumpet playing was evil somehow. He described how the voices got worse as the trumpet playing got better, as if the music was triggering something in his brain. He tried to hide it from Louis, tried to pretend everything was fine during their lessons, but the internal chaos was becoming unbearable. By 15, James was having full psychotic breaks, hallucinating, unable to distinguish between reality and the voices in his head. He ran away from the orphanage because he believed he was dangerous, that staying would hurt Sister Mary Catherine or Louis or the other children. He changed his name, abandoned his trumpet, and spent the next 55 years in and out of psychiatric hospitals and homeless shelters, never playing music again because he believed the trumpet had caused his madness. Dr. Chen contacted Michael Cogswell at the Louis Armstrong House Museum, told him what she had learned. Cogswell came to Creedmoor, confirmed details of David Johnson's story against the recordings and what little documentation existed about James Crawford. It was him, the lost prodigy, the boy Louis had called the next me. Now a dying man who had spent his entire adult life believing he was insane, who had never known that schizophrenia was a treatable illness, who had lived in poverty and illness because he thought he deserved punishment for being broken. David Johnson died on April 12, 2015, at Creedmoor Psychiatric Center. He was 71 years old. In his belongings, they found a small photograph, creased and faded, of a young black boy holding a trumpet. On the back, in Louis Armstrong's handwriting, James Crawford, The Future of Jazz, 1958. The story of James Crawford exploded when it became public in 2016. Journalists wrote about the tragedy of untreated mental illness destroying a musical genius. Mental health advocates pointed to James's story as an example of how schizophrenia in adolescents, especially in vulnerable populations like orphans, often goes unrecognized and untreated. Music historians mourned the loss of what could have been, the trumpet player who might have been as great as Louis Armstrong believed, whose potential was destroyed by an illness he never understood. The Louis Armstrong House Museum created a special exhibit featuring the lesson recordings, James's photograph, and the story of the mentorship. Visitors listened to the tapes and heard a 12-year-old boy learning to make a trumpet sing, heard Louis Armstrong's patience and belief and love, heard a talent that would never be realized. But perhaps the most profound response came from the psychiatric community. Dr. Chen wrote an article about James Crawford's case, using it to illustrate how schizophrenia in adolescence is often missed or misinterpreted, especially in marginalized populations. She noted that James's belief that the trumpet playing caused his voices was a common delusion in people with schizophrenia, the brain trying to make sense of symptoms by creating cause-effect narratives that seem logical to the patient but are actually manifestations of the illness. If James had received proper diagnosis and treatment in 1959, he might have been able to continue playing trumpet while managing his mental health. The medications available even then could have helped. But he was an orphan, a child without advocates or resources beyond Sister Mary Catherine and Louis Armstrong, neither of whom understood mental illness enough to recognize what was happening. And so James ran and spent 55 years suffering from an illness that could have been treated, losing not just his music, but his entire life to a disease he thought was his fault. The tragedy of James Crawford is not just that a talented musician was lost. The tragedy is that a child with schizophrenia was left to suffer alone, believing he was cursed or evil, when he was actually sick and deserving of treatment and compassion. The tragedy is that Louis Armstrong, who had tried to give James everything, could not give him the one thing that would have saved him, understanding that mental illness is medical, not moral, and that talent and illness can coexist if the illness is properly managed. The tragedy is all the music that James never played, all the life he never lived, because no one recognized that the voices in his head were symptoms, not truth. Louis Armstrong House Museum still plays the recordings of Louis teaching James that. Visitors can hear the progression from early lessons to advanced technique, can hear James's talent flowering under Louis's guidance, can hear the warmth and pride in Louis's voice when James got something right. These recordings are all that remains of James Crawford, the musician. But they also document something else, the sound of mentorship, of belief, of one artist trying to pass on not just skill, but value to a child who had never been told he mattered. Louis failed to save James from schizophrenia, but he succeeded in giving James 3 years of knowing he was gifted, 3 years of having someone believe in him. That could not cure an illness, but it was not nothing. The photograph of James holding his trumpet, the one found in his belongings when he died, now sits in a frame at the museum next to the reel-to-reel recorder. The exhibit is titled The Lost Student, James Crawford and the Limits of Mentorship. Museum guides explain to visitors that talent is not always enough, that sometimes circumstances beyond anyone's control destroy potential, that even Louis Armstrong could not save everyone he tried to help. But they also explain that trying mattered, that those 3 years of lessons gave James Crawford something precious, even if he could not keep it. And they play the recordings, letting James's trumpet speak for him one more time, letting the world hear what Louis heard. The gift that was there, the future that never happened, the boy who could have been the next Louis Armstrong, but instead became David Johnson, a man lost to an illness no one understood in time to save him. The lesson for those who hear James Crawford's story is complex and uncomfortable. It is about the randomness of mental illness, about how talent offers no protection from disease, about how good intentions, and even genius-level mentorship, cannot overcome systemic failures in mental health care. It is about how an orphan child in 1959 had no safety net when his brain began to malfunction, how running away and changing his name seemed like his only option, when what he needed was medication and therapy. It is about how Louis Armstrong, for all his fame and resources, could not find a boy who did not want to be found, could not save someone from an illness he did not understand. And it is about the recordings, the only evidence that James Crawford, the prodigy, ever existed, that his talent was real, that for 3 years he was exactly what Louis believed he could be. Those recordings are precious not just as musical artifacts but as proof that James Crawford mattered, that his life had value even though it ended in tragedy, that he deserves to be remembered as more than a cautionary tale. He deserves to be remembered as the boy who made Louis Armstrong believe in the future of jazz, even though that future never arrived.